What about the various traditions that are attached to the holiday, like Christmas trees and gift giving and holly, and especially Santa Claus? Because it's these specific traditions where a lot of Christians get hung up because they're worried that somehow participating in them might be participating in pagan practices. So let's just look at these for a minute. We're going to talk about Santa Claus now. So I'm just warning you, if you've got kids listening that you don't want to hear this, or some spoilers are going to happen. Probably nothing is more closely connected to Christmas than the idea of Santa Claus traveling the world on Christmas Eve and putting presents under every tree. And that current image of Santa Claus as a hefty man with a white beard who climbs down chimneys really comes from the 19th century. But the origin story dates all the way back to the 4th century to an obscure bishop by the name of Nicholas. Nicholas was born in the town of Patara in the part of the world that's Turkey today, and he was a bishop in the coastal town not far away from his birth called Myra. He attended the Council of Nicaea in 325, but he didn't play a very significant role there, and that's about all we know about his life for certain. But he was also well known for being a kind and generous man, so much so that there are actually 5 popes that were named after him. And when Nicholas's parents died, apparently they left him a large inheritance, and he decided to use that money to help people in need. The most famous story, probably legendary, but also the one that's most closely connected to Christmas, is about a man who had no dowry for his 3 daughters. Now, dowry, in case you're not familiar, it's a gift, or it's property, or it's money that's brought by a bride to the groom, to the husband, as part of the marriage arrangement. Now, in those days, most women could not get married without a dowry. And that was a very disgraceful fate, maybe one of the worst fates that a woman could face, because they would likely be destitute the rest of their lives. Often these women would end up being sold into slavery or prostitution. So this was a very dire situation for the women as well as for the father. And so the story goes that one night, while everyone's asleep, Nicholas throws a bag of gold coins into an open window to supply the dowry for the oldest daughter. And then later he did it again for the second daughter. But still, by this point, nobody knew where the money was coming from. So then when it came time for the third daughter to get married, the father stays up all night and discovers that it's Nicholas who had given them the money for the dowry. And one version of the story has Nicholas avoiding that discovery by throwing the bag of coins into the chimney, where it happened to fall into a stocking that was hanging to dry out in front of the fireplace. So whether these stories are historical or an invention, the point is that he was known as a generous guy that helped people in need. And Nicholas's charity work became well known, and people continued it after he died. They continued to give to the needy, and apparently some people would even hang stockings in front of their fireplace, hoping that Nicholas would pay them a visit. And he died in 343, but his legend grew. He was reported to have performed numerous miracles, and so he was eventually canonized by the Catholic Church, and he became known as Saint Nicholas or Saint Nick. And the legend of Saint Nicholas continued through the Middle Ages. He died December 6th. That became the day of his feast in the church. European children were known to leave their shoes outside their home on the eve of Saint Nick's feast day, and in the morning, the shoes would have candy in them. So when Protestantism took hold in Northern Europe, Saint Nicholas was replaced by a less Catholic-sounding person. In England, he became Father Christmas. In the Netherlands, he was known as Sinterklaas, and the Dutch Sinterklaas was a hefty man with a white beard who carried a naughty and nice list. And so the Santa Claus we know today owes a lot to this Dutch version. In Germany and Austria, the legend changed. Like we talked about, Martin Luther wanted to shift people's attention from Catholic saints and onto Jesus. And so he moved the night of gift giving from December 5th to Christmas Eve, where St. Nick was replaced by the Christ child, which in German is Christkindl. And when Europeans began migrating to the U.S., they kind of brought all these legends and traditions about Christmas with them, and they were kind of all mixed up and Americanized. So the English Christ's Mass became Christmas. The German Christkindl became Christkringle. The Dutch Sinterklaas became Santa Claus. And so you see all of it kind of melding together. And at the start of the 19th century, the story of Santa Claus was still in its infancy. The Santa we know today didn't exist yet. He wasn't jolly. He didn't wear a red suit. He didn't have reindeer or sled. But then in 1822, all that began to change. This was the year that Clement Clarke Moore wrote one of the most famous poems in American history a visit from St. Nicholas. We know it as the night before Christmas. And in this story, Santa is an elf who descends through chimneys to deliver gifts to children. And Moore's Santa rode a sleigh led by 8 flying reindeer. He gave names to the reindeer that are known today, except Donder has been changed to Donner. Blixen has now become Blixen. And Santa is described in that poem as having rosy cheeks and a red nose. He wore fur, but it doesn't say what color the fur coat was. He also had a white beard, and he smoked a pipe, and his round belly shook when he laughed. But there's not very many other details. Now, our Santa Claus today has exchanged his nicotine habit for a milk and cookie addiction, but in a lot of other ways, he's still very similar to the character we read about in Moore's poem. Then in 1863, Thomas Nast began drawing cartoons of Santa Claus in Harper's Weekly magazine, building on what Clement Clarke Moore had written. And he grew Santa into a full-grown man instead of an elf. And originally the suit was brown, but eventually it became red. And Nast's Santa had a bigger tummy. And Nast depicted Santa as living in the North Pole with a naughty and nice list and so on. But even Nast's cartoons weren't quite enough to produce the Santa that we know today. For that, we owe a debt to the Coca-Cola bottling company. In 1931, Coke began using Santa Claus in its advertising as a way to boost winter sales during the Depression. And they used Nast's descriptions, adding black boots and a black belt. And it's this version of Santa, invented by Coca-Cola, that we know as Santa today. So Santa, as he was portrayed by Nast in 1863, was meant to be a contrast to these ruthless, cold-hearted businessmen of the era called the robber barons. They were really known for robbing the poor through their very unscrupulous business practices. Santa was kind of the opposite of that. He gave gifts to the poor. He was the ultimate good guy. And so you have to realize that the idea was to try to influence society positively through this positive role model. And these things may or may not be connected, but it's interesting that by the end of the 1800s, philanthropy had become a very popular hobby among the very wealthy in America. Now, some people have tried to identify Santa Claus with an evil figure, in some cases even identifying him as Krampus, who is a legendary goat-like figure that was invented in the 12th century to do the dirty work of St. Nicholas. And this seems to be an evil twist on the concept that only good kids receive gifts from St. Nick. They added a character who punishes or even kidnaps the bad kids. And this is like a very misguided attempt to get children to obey using terrible fear tactics. Actually, the Catholic Church tried to ban this tradition, and it has no presence in traditional American celebrations of Christmas. But that doesn't prevent it from being the target of some people's accusations. Some people try to use Krampus as proof of the dark origins of Christmas, even going so far in some cases to identify Krampus with Santa Claus himself. But that's complete nonsense. Krampus has nothing whatsoever to do with the history of the tradition that led to Santa Claus. As for Santa Claus, a lot of Christians choose not to involve him in their celebrations at Christmas. Maybe they feel uncomfortable with an omniscient being that no one ever sees, who knows if you've been good or bad. Sounds like he's replacing God. That's understandable. Even more understandable is that we don't want to deceive our children by making them believe a story that we know isn't true. And even more understandable, we don't want to have to explain to our children why mommy was kissing Santa Claus. It's so awkward.